Snow fell heavy and unforgiving, sealing the Montana backcountry in a silence so deep it felt intentional. Beneath that frozen weight, a Navy SEAL lay buried alive, hands bound, chest pinned, breath rationed to seconds. No radio signal, no backup, no one coming. Then through the whiteout, a shape moved. Juror 22. A German shepherd burst from the trees, muscles tight with urgency, nose cutting low through the storm as if it could smell the difference between snow and death. The dog stopped, hard ears snapping forward, and barked once sharp commanding before tearing into the ground. Snow flew. Ice cracked. 0047. A flashlight beam shook, cutting through the drift, revealing a face staring up from the grave. The SEAL was alive. They clawed him free with bare hands. But before relief could settle, gunfire shattered the quiet. The K-9 was hit, collapsing in the snow, and as blood stained the white ground red, it became clear this wasn't an accident. This was an execution attempt. And what the SEAL had uncovered beneath the snow was a secret powerful enough to make people disappear. Snow fell without mercy over the Gallatin foothills near Bozeman, Montana, thick enough to erase roads, sounds, and intentions, turning the forest into a white cathedral that listened but never answered. Luke Carter lay beneath that snow, pressed into the frozen ground as if the mountain itself had decided he was excess weight. 37 years old, Navy SEAL by trade and by bone. Luke had the build of a man carved by years of resistance. Broad shoulders, dense muscle, earned rather than displayed, a face marked by sharp cheekbones and a crooked nose broken long ago in a training accident he never bothered to correct. A short dark beard clung to his jaw, threaded faintly with gray that had appeared after his last deployment, the kind of gray that came from decisions, not age. His eyes, steel blue when open, were closed now, lashes crusted with ice breath scraping thin tunnels upward through packed snow. His hands were bound tight behind his back wrists, burning where zip ties bit into numbed skin. Someone had been deliberate. The snow above him was layered, pressed down by boots and shovels, compacted with the efficiency of people who had done this before. Luke understood that even through the haze creeping into his mind. He had spent years learning the difference between chaos and intention. This was intention. Hours earlier, though, time had already begun to lose its shape. Luke had made the mistake of interfering. He had followed a trail that wasn't on any map, traced shipments that moved too quietly, men who talked about performance enhancers with the reverence of false priests. They weren't selling strength. They were testing a banned neural stimulant designed to override fear and fatigue, a chemical key meant to unlock obedience at the cost of cognition. Luke had seen the data. He had seen what it did to lab animals. He had shut down one transfer with brutal efficiency, believing speed would be enough. It wasn't. Now the cold negotiated with his body inch by inch. His lungs fought for air like a debtor begging time. Panic tried to rise, but Luke pressed it down the way he always had. Panic was loud. Panic wasted oxygen. He focused instead on Ranger. Ranger would be looking for him. The thought wasn't sentimental. It was tactical hope. Ranger, his K-9 partner, 5 years old, black and tan German shepherd, with a thick winter coat and amber-brown eyes that missed nothing, had been trained to read terrain the way Luke read people. Ranger wasn't loud or playful. He moved with the controlled patience of a working animal who understood consequences. He had scars beneath his fur from a previous handler, lost overseas scars that made him wary of sudden touch and fiercely intolerant of abandonment. Luke had taken him in afterward, not out of charity, but recognition. They were both men who slept lightly and trusted slowly. Ranger's loyalty wasn't dramatic. It was precise. He would notice the silence first. As Luke's thoughts slowed, memories rose uninvited. His father's voice quiet, disappointed, never cruel. A steel-framed house in Ohio. The first time Luke learned that doing the right thing didn't guarantee anyone would clap. Those lessons had shaped him more than medals ever had. He had learned to accept solitude as payment, but this being buried alive for choosing interference tested even his discipline. Pressure wrapped his chest. His fingers tingled, then went numb. The snow above him groaned faintly as the wind shifted a sound like a door closing far away. Luke forced his jaw to move, trying to create space for breath. His thoughts flickered. If Ranger didn't find him soon, the mountain would keep him. Above ground unseen, Ranger was already working. The dog moved through the storm low and steady, head down tail, stiff with purpose. Snow clung to his muzzle and lashes, but he did not shake it off. He read the forest with his nose sorting layers of scent like pages in a book written for him alone. Luke's trail was faint, broken by wind and boot traffic, but Ranger caught the human fear beneath it, sharp and unmistakable. When he stopped, it was sudden enough that his muscles locked. His ears snapped forward. He circled once, then began digging with frantic precision, snow flying in heavy arcs. The forest answered with silence. Ranger barked one sharp, commanding sound and lunged away from the spot, sprinting toward the service road where machines sometimes came. His stride was long and powerful, but urgency sharpened it into something wild. He would find people. He would bring them back. That was the rule now. Behind him, the disturbed snow marked the place where Luke Carter still breathed, barely waiting for the mountain to decide whether it would release him. The storm did not soften when Ranger reached the service road. It only changed its voice, dropping from a howl to a grinding hiss that scoured metal and nerve alike. Headlights cut weak cones through the white as a park utility truck idled, half-buried, its engine coughing like an old man who refused to quit. Ranger burst from the trees coated in snow, chest heaving, eyes bright with a command he had never learned to doubt. He skidded to a stop in front of the truck and barked short, sharp, urgent, then turned and ran a few steps back toward the forest, looking over his shoulder to make sure he was being understood. Inside the cab, Mark Ellison flinched. He was in his early 40s, a state wildlife ranger with a lean, rangy build shaped by years of winter patrols. His face was narrow, weather-browned, with a hooked nose that had been broken once in a bar fight he no longer talked about, and a trimmed, sandy beard that never quite hid the lines of fatigue at his eyes. Mark had learned to trust patterns more than people. Storms had taught him that hesitation killed faster than mistakes. He stepped out into the snow, boots crunching, and crouched to Ranger's level. The dog did not approach. He spun and bolted again, barking once more, the sound cutting clean through the wind. "All right," Mark muttered, already pulling his radio free. "I'm listening." Ranger led hard, weaving through trees that closed behind him like a wound sealing shut. Mark followed as best he could, breath, burning boots sinking. The snow deepened, fast packed and layered in a way that made the back of his neck prickle. This wasn't drift. This was worked. When Ranger stopped and began digging again, Mark dropped to his knees and drove his gloved hands into the hole the dog was tearing open. The flashlight beam shook as it found dark fabric, then frost-caked skin, then a mouth gasping like it had forgotten the rules of air. Luke Carter came up from the ground in pieces, first a shoulder, then a face dragged into light that felt too bright to be mercy. His eyes fluttered unfocused, the blue dulled to slate. Mark cut the bindings with a knife that had opened more than one animal trap, then shouted into his radio until his voice broke through the static. Ranger circled, whining, low nose pressed to Luke's cheek, breath puffing warm as if he could will heat back into him. The gunshot came from deeper in the trees, flat and ugly, a sound that did not belong to nature. Ranger reacted before anyone else could think. He pivoted, body coiling, and took off toward the sound. Then another shot cracked and the dog yelped, tumbling hard into the snow. His back leg folded wrong beneath him, blood blooming red against the white like a terrible flower. Mark swore and dragged Luke farther from the disturbed ground, shielding him with his body as he keyed his radio again. The shooter did not advance. Whoever it was had already decided the message had been sent. Silence returned, heavier now. Ranger tried to stand and failed, then dragged himself forward with his front legs, teeth bared, not in pain, but in defiance. Mark crawled to him, hands shaking as he wrapped a scarf around the wound, pressing hard. Ranger's eyes locked on Luke the whole time, unblinking, as if distance itself were the enemy. By the time the rescue team arrived, 2 EMTs and a sheriff's deputy, whose name Mark barely caught the storm, had eased just enough to let sound travel. Deputy Ryan Keller was young, mid-20s, broad-faced with a buzz cut, and the earnest stiffness of someone still trying to grow into authority. He spoke too loud at first, then corrected himself when Mark shot him a look. Luke was loaded onto a sled oxygen mask, fogging with each ragged breath. Ranger went on to another, sedated enough to stop fighting the hands that tried to save him. The hospital in Bozeman glowed like a ship at sea when they reached it. Luke drifted in and out, aware only of light and the weight of hands that knew what they were doing. In one lucid moment he caught Mark's sleeve and rasped a warning about a neural stimulant, about shipments disguised as medicine, about men who would come back if the trail wasn't burned clean. Mark listened without interrupting. He had learned that when men like this spoke, it was never for drama. Ranger's surgery took hours. Dr. Hannah Brooks, the on-call veterinary surgeon, emerged afterward with shoulders slumped but eyes steady. She was in her late 30s, tall and narrow-hipped hair pulled into a severe black bun that revealed a pale, freckled face, unused to rest. She spoke carefully, the way people do when they refuse to lie. The bullet had shattered bone. They had removed what they could, stabilized the joint, but nerve damage was likely. There was a chance Ranger would never walk normally again. Luke heard that part later from a nurse who didn't know how to soften words for men who had survived worse. He turned his face to the wall and closed his eyes, shame and gratitude tangling until he couldn't tell which hurt more. He had accepted risk for himself easily. For Ranger it felt unforgivable. When they wheeled the dog past his room on the way to recovery, Luke lifted a hand he could barely feel and whispered an apology that Ranger, even sedated, seemed to answer by thumping his tail once against the gurney. Outside, the storm finally broke, leaving the town hushed and gleaming under fresh snow. Mark stood at the hospital window and watched dawn creep over the ridgeline, thinking about layers pressed down by human boots and the way a dog had refused to believe the mountain owned a man's life. The wind had answered back tonight, not with mercy, but with witnesses. Morning came thin and pale over Bozeman, the kind of light that didn't promise warmth so much as permission to keep going. Luke Carter woke to the rhythmic beep of a monitor and the ache that followed men back from places they hadn't meant to visit. His body felt borrowed heavy, reluctant, each breath a reminder that the mountain had almost kept him. A bruise bloomed dark along his ribs. Frostbite traced a faint map across his fingers, yet his mind was clear in the way it got only after terror had passed, when fear turned practical and left behind a ledger of costs. Ranger's cost sat foremost. Across the hall, behind glass that smelled faintly of antiseptic and wet fur, Ranger lay wrapped in bandages and metal. The German shepherd's powerful hind leg was encased in a stabilizing brace, pins holding bone where a bullet had tried to teach permanence. Even sedated Ranger's ears twitched at hallway sounds, discipline embedded deeper than pain. He was 5 years old, built for endurance, shoulders broad and chest deep, his coat shaved around the wound revealing scars old and new. Luke watched from a wheelchair, jaw tight, a man accustomed to calculating risk now, counting seconds between breaths as if they were debts he could repay. A physical therapist introduced herself with a voice practiced in steadiness. Maya Chen was in her early 30s, compact and athletic hair cropped short to keep it out of her eyes, skin warm olive against the hospital's white. She moved like a climber, economical, precise, and spoke with a humor that knew when to step back. Maya had grown up in Spokane, she said, and learned early that bodies told the truth even when people didn't. She explained Ranger's plan not as a miracle, but as work hydrotherapy, to coax nerves awake, range of motion drills to teach the joint its name again, months measured in millimeters. "He'll be angry," she said softly, glancing at Ranger. "That's good. Anger means he's still negotiating with the future." Luke nodded, the smallest motion a negotiation of its own. He had been raised to believe that grit was quiet and recovery unglamorous. Still, when Ranger tried to stand later that afternoon and failed hindquarters, slipping nails scrabbling, Luke felt something old crack in his chest. The dog did not whine. He reset his front paws, jaw clenched, eyes bright with insulted pride. A laugh escaped Luke, thin and surprised. Humor, he thought, was the body's way of keeping blood moving when hope stalled. Downstairs, a different kind of work gathered momentum. Agent Emily Parker arrived without ceremony, a knock that waited for permission before it entered the room. She was late 30s, tall and straight-backed auburn hair pulled into a low knot that showed a long, serious face. Her eyes were gray and alert, the sort that weighed rooms the way other people weighed words. Emily wore a navy coat that fit without flattering, and her badge flashed once then disappeared, authority carried lightly. She listened more than she spoke, letting Luke describe crates mislabeled as supplements, the sterile tang of solvents in a warehouse that pretended to be a clinic, men who smiled too carefully. She took notes by hand, the pen moving like a metronome. "They'll clean up," she said when he finished. "But they'll make mistakes if we don't rush them." Mark Ellison hovered near the doorway, arms crossed posture that suggested he preferred weather to meetings. He'd shaved the sandy beard, trimmed close eyes, reddened by a night without sleep. He trusted Emily, he said later, because she didn't rush conclusions. Trust in his world was built from silence, honored. Deputy Keller drifted in and out, quieter now, his earnestness tempered by the understanding that gunshots in snow meant grown men had chosen something ugly. In the veterinary wing, Dr. Hannah Brooks reviewed Ranger's scans with a fingertip tracing white lines across bone. She had changed out of scrubs into a charcoal sweater that softened her severity. Freckles bright against pale skin. Her voice remained careful. "There's inflammation around the nerve," she said. "We won't know the extent for weeks. Pain control patience." She met Luke's eyes, then steady. "He's not done." Doctors learned when to leave hope unnamed. Naming it could turn it brittle. Ranger began therapy 2 days later. The water treadmill hummed like a hive, warm water lifting his weight while his legs relearned argument. Maya stood hip-deep beside him, hands ready, praise measured. Ranger hated the harness at first, teeth flashing in irritation, then settled into the work with the seriousness of a craftsman. Each step was a negotiation with memory. Luke counted them the way he counted reps in a gym that smelled like iron and resolve. When Ranger faltered, Luke spoke once, low, steady, no pleading, just presence. The dog's ears flicked back, then forward. He took another step. Between sessions, Emily briefed Luke on progress. A warehouse lease tied to a shell company. A truck routed through 3 states to blur jurisdiction. The stimulant had a name buried under acronyms banned years ago, resurrected by greed, that dressed itself as innovation. Emily's jaw tightened when Luke mentioned the shooter. "They wanted Ranger," she said. They knew what he meant. Luke looked back through the glass at the dog sleeping with one eye open, meaning he thought was expensive. Night settled again. Snow fell politely now, as if embarrassed by its earlier violence. Luke wheeled himself closer to Ranger's pen and rested his forehead against the glass. He remembered a steel-framed house and a father who believed showing up mattered more than winning. He remembered taking Ranger home the first night, the dog circling twice before lying down, trust offered like a coin you didn't spend lightly. "We're still here," Luke murmured. Ranger's tail thumped, once controlled even in sleep. Outside, Mark stepped into the cold and listened to the quiet. It wasn't empty anymore. It held names, witnesses, the slow machinery of consequences. He pulled his collar up and smiled despite himself. The wind had answered back yes, but so had the work. The city settled into a brittle calm that week, the kind that pretended to be recovery while hiding fractures beneath the surface. Luke Carter learned the limits of stillness the hard way. His body healed in small concessions, swelling, receded sensation returned to his fingertips, but his mind refused rest. He watched Ranger's sessions through glass that reflected his own face back at him, older than it had been a month earlier. The beard along his jaw, darker and more uneven, eyes sharpened by the habit of counting exits. Ranger, meanwhile, learned patience with the resentment of a soldier benched by injury. Each day the dog's hind leg accepted a fraction more weight. Each night it trembled with fatigue. Progress, Luke realized, was not a straight line. It was a conversation that argued back. Agent Emily Parker returned with a different cadence in her voice, less observation, more edge. She arrived carrying a thin folder, and the smell of cold air coats still dusted with snow. "We've got a leak," she said, not looking at Luke so much as at the room as if walls could be persuaded to listen. She explained that one of the shell companies routing the shipments had accelerated its liquidation. Servers wiped. Trucks re-registered overnight. Someone was moving furniture. Emily's posture remained upright, shoulders square, but a faint crease deepened between her brows. She had learned years earlier in Phoenix Narcotics that momentum favored those willing to look boring while doing dangerous work. The hospital became a crossroads. Nurses whispered about unfamiliar men asking for directions they didn't need. A maintenance door that usually stuck swung easily one morning. Luke noticed the change in sound before anyone noticed the change in story. He asked for a notebook and began sketching timelines with the same precision he once reserved for routes through hostile streets. Mark Ellison stopped by after shift, bringing coffee that tasted like burnt pine and resolve. Mark's lean frame seemed to fold inward these days, as if he were conserving heat for a longer winter. "They're sniffing," he said, nodding toward Ranger's wing. "Not the dog. Us." Ranger's therapy took a turn when the nerve response plateaued. Maya Chen adjusted the regimen without apology, swapping repetition for resistance. She added uneven surfaces, short climbs, tasks that demanded Ranger's attention rather than his compliance. "Motivation wakes nerves," she said, smiling with one corner of her mouth. Ranger disliked the wobble board on principle. He planted his front paws and glared as if insulted by the concept of balance. Luke laughed again, soft, surprised, and the sound startled them both. Humor, it turned out, was contagious. A new face appeared at the edge of the investigation, introduced by Emily with a caution that felt like a seatbelt clicking into place. Noah Whitaker was in his early 40s, tall and narrow, with a pale complexion that suggested too many nights under fluorescent lights. His hair was ash blonde, thinning at the temples, and he wore wire-rimmed glasses that he removed when anxious, polishing them with a sleeve worn shiny at the elbow. Noah had once worked in compliance for a biotech contractor now under scrutiny. He spoke carefully, choosing verbs like a man choosing steps across ice. He described a culture that rewarded speed over ethics, trial data massaged into obedience. He did not call himself brave. He called himself tired. Something in his voice suggested that tiredness, when it curdled, became courage by default. The threat sharpened when a fire alarm tripped at 3 in the morning. Protocol evacuated a wing. Confusion bought seconds. Luke rolled himself into Ranger's room on instinct chair, bumping the doorframe. Smoke never came. The alarm died with a cough. Security blamed a faulty sensor. Emily did not. She stood in the hallway afterward, gray eyes scanning faces, jaw set. "They're measuring response times," she said, "seeing who moves where." Luke watched Ranger rise, stiff but steady, body angled toward the door. The dog's ears tracked footsteps, cataloging the night. Recovery, Luke learned, was a series of choices disguised as routines. He chose to show up for Ranger's hardest sessions, even when his ribs protested the wheelchair's jolt. He chose to talk carefully with Noah, helping Emily translate jargon into patterns. He chose to sleep when he could, trusting Mark to watch the perimeter like a man who understood weather as language. And Ranger chose daily to stand again. Not well, not gracefully, but long enough to make a point. The breakthrough came small and strange. During a session, Maya introduced a scent puzzle to distract Ranger from pain. The dog froze, nostrils flaring, attention snapping to a memory rather than a command. He took 3 steps without favoring the injured leg, tail lifting with the seriousness of a flag raised in wind. Luke's throat closed. 3 steps were not victory. They were evidence. Emily called later that evening with news that did not sound like news. A warehouse lease surfaced under a cousin's name. A truck caught on a traffic cam with a distinctive dent Luke remembered from a night that smelled like solvents. Noah provided a purchase order number that refused to die, popping up where it shouldn't. "We can move," Emily said, but quietly. She did not say when. Timing was the blade. Outside, snow returned gentler this time, as if apologizing for its earlier excess. Mark stood by Luke's window, hands in pockets, watching flakes learn the city's geometry. "You ever notice," he said, "how people trust clean stories?" Luke nodded. Clean stories ask nothing. Ranger shifted behind them, brace clicking softly as he adjusted his stance. The dog held for 5 seconds, then 8. Luke counted. When the night ended, it did so without ceremony. The fire alarm panel remained silent. Security logs showed nothing useful. The city slept, believing in maintenance and mourning. Luke wheeled himself back to his room, shoulders squared by habit, and wrote one line in his notebook before sleep claimed him. "Move when they think we can't." Ranger, curled nearby, thumped his tail once as if agreeing with a plan he already understood. Snow retreated unevenly that week, not surrendering so much as revealing what it had hidden out of politeness. Meltwater traced dark seams along curbs and culverts, carrying grit oil and small truths downhill. Luke Carter noticed first because recovery had trained his attention downward. You learned where your weight went. You learned which surfaces lied. The city felt the same, solid on top, treacherous underneath. Emily Parker chose the timing with the patience of someone who had waited out worse storms. She arrived before sunrise with a thermos and a map rolled tight under one arm, auburn hair escaping its knot in tired waves. The lines in her face had deepened, but her posture remained unbent the way it got when she stopped hoping and started deciding. "They're moving inventory," she said, spreading the map across the small conference table the hospital had loaned them. "Not fast. Careful. That means they think we're slower than we are." Luke listened. Chin tucked, the habit of absorbing briefings settling back into his bones. He could walk short distances now, cane tapping softly like punctuation ribs, still tender but trustworthy. He was dressed in a plain gray hoodie and jeans, no insignia, no signal beard trimmed close to keep from catching hands. He felt naked without gear, and oddly freer for it. Ranger lay beside his chair, brace removed for the day, the injured hind leg wrapped in a flexible support. The dog's chest rose steady. His eyes followed the map as if geography could be scented. The plan was unglamorous by design. Emily would let the shell company believe its erasure had worked. Noah Whitaker would feed a small, precise mistake into a ledger, a duplicate order number where none should exist, bait that would force a correction. "They'll send someone to fix it," Emily said. "People who clean don't trust computers." Mark Ellison nodded, weathered face thoughtful. He would coordinate perimeter watches along the access roads he knew, like Knuckles. Deputy Keller would not be invited. Youth learned by exclusion sometimes. A new ally joined them quietly that afternoon, introduced without ceremony, because she preferred it that way. Tessa Morales was a city infrastructure inspector in her mid-40s, average height, wiry strength in her forearms, hair iron gray pulled into a low ponytail that didn't care about fashion. Her skin was olive eyes, dark and appraising, the kind that read concrete the way others read palms. She had grown up fixing things, because no one else would. "Storm drains remember," she said, tapping the map. "People forget where they dump." Tessa's voice carried the confidence of someone who trusted physical evidence more than testimony. They met at the edge of a maintenance corridor near the old rail spur at dusk. The place smelled like wet leaves and rust. Luke felt Ranger tense beside him, ears flicking, nose working overtime. Meltwater ran in thin ribbons, whispering against concrete. Tessa crouched and lifted a grate with a grunt, revealing a channel stained faintly darker than the rest. "See that?" she asked. "Solvents leave ghosts." Emily snapped photos. Luke steadied himself, cane planted, and leaned close enough to feel the cold breathing up from the city's lungs. Ranger surprised them by stepping forward. 3 careful steps, then 4 weight, shifting with deliberation rather than courage. He sniffed once, twice, then sat tail lifting just enough to signal attention. Luke's mouth curved despite himself. The dog was learning when to conserve. Tessa smiled, quick and genuine. "Smart," she said. "He's reading the ground." The correction came faster than Emily expected. A black utility van rolled through the access road just after midnight, lights dimmed, engine idling with a patient purr. Two men stepped out, faces unremarkable by design jackets, clean boots, practical. One carried a case that looked medical until you noticed the way he held it, careful of slosh. Mark relayed positions over a whisper channel, his voice as steady as snowfall. Emily watched from a shadowed doorway, recording devices humming softly. Luke stayed back, not out of fear, but respect for limits. He had learned that choosing distance could be a tactic. Tessa waited until the men knelt by the drain. She moved, then flashlight snapping on badge lifted just long enough to break rhythm. "City inspection," she said, tone bored, lethal in its normalcy. The men froze, half-second tells that Emily would later call the hinge of the night. One bolted, the other dropped the case and ran the wrong way straight into Mark's world. The chase was brief and ugly. Slush stole traction. Panic did the rest. The case cracked when it hit the curb, liquid bleeding into the gutter with a chemical sheen that didn't belong to spring. Emily's jaw tightened. She didn't touch it. She documented. Ranger barked once, sharp, contained, then held as if waiting for permission he did not need. Luke felt pride and fear tangle and resolved them by breathing. They had names by dawn. Not the top, never the top, but names that pointed upward like arrows. Emily moved fast now, warrants blooming like frost patterns across desks. Noah's duplicate order forced an internal scramble that exposed a procurement chain. Tessa pulled maintenance logs that showed unusual after-hours access. Mark's cameras caught the van twice more, always skirting the same routes. The city began to confess through its infrastructure. Recovery complicated everything. Ranger's legs swelled after the long night tremor, returning with vengeance. Maya Chen adjusted again, ice packs and gentler work voice, calm but firm. "You don't pay tomorrow's rent with today's progress," she said, rubbing Ranger's shoulders. The dog leaned into her hands, then glanced at Luke as if apologizing for the setback. Luke crouched carefully and rested his forehead against Ranger's. "We go at your pace," he whispered. The truth surprised him. He meant it. Emily briefed Luke in the afternoon, exhaustion edging her words. "They know now," she said. "They'll burn faster." Luke nodded. "Let them," he said quietly. Burning leaves smoke. He had learned something since the mountain survival wasn't always escape. Sometimes it was staying visible long enough to be believed. Night fell clean. The city breathed. Luke walked the corridor, once cane-tapping Ranger beside him, counting steps with solemn care. 5 seconds standing became 10. 10 became 15. Not victory. Evidence. Outside water carried secrets downhill toward a river that did not care who lied first. The arrests did not come with sirens. They never did not at this altitude of guilt. Instead, Bozeman entered a quieter phase, a held breath that made even ordinary sounds feel suspicious. Luke Carter sensed it the way he once sensed ambushes, not with fear, but with an absence of noise where noise should have been. Recovery had sharpened that sense. When you learned to walk again, you learned to listen. Luke could now manage the hospital corridor without the cane on good mornings. His gait was still guarded, ribs reminding him of debt, but his shoulders had squared back into their old alignment, the posture of a man who carried responsibility like a pack he'd already adjusted to. The beard along his jaw was fuller now, dark and uneven, shadowing a face that looked carved rather than tired. He spoke little to staff, thanked them carefully, and saved his energy for Ranger. Ranger's world had shrunk to measured spaces and rules. The German Shepherd was stronger in the front now, chest thick with effort, the injured hind leg responding in fits and starts like a stubborn engine. His coat had grown back around the scar, the fur there slightly lighter, a visible memory. He hated the brace and tolerated it anyway, eyes flicking to Luke whenever Maya Chen tightened the straps as if to say, "This is your fault." Luke answered with presence, not apology. Guilt, he had learned, wasted oxygen. Emily Parker came in late that afternoon with the kind of focus that suggested she had already decided where the night would end. Her coat was off sleeves, rolled auburn hair pinned tighter than usual. "They're compressing," she said, laying out photos and timestamps. Shell companies folding into one another, records migrating. That means one of two things. She held up two fingers. They're preparing to disappear or to move something big. Mark Ellison leaned against the wall, arms crossed, jaw working as he considered the map. You don't disappear when the ground's thawing, he said. You move. His voice was low, the cadence of someone used to weather outlasting plans. Emily nodded. Exactly. A new name entered the room like a draft through a cracked window. Caleb Ross did not announce himself. Emily did it for him carefully. Caleb was a logistics contractor in his early 50s, tall and broad-shouldered with a thick neck and a face that looked permanently flushed, as if embarrassed by its own existence. His hair was iron gray, cut too short, and his beard, neatly trimmed, failed to hide a scar that tugged at the corner of his mouth when he spoke. He had once managed distribution for a pharmaceutical supplier now tangled in the case. He claimed ignorance with the conviction of a man who had practiced the line. What changed him, Emily said later, was not conscience, but arithmetic. He realized the numbers no longer added up in ways that protected him. Fear, when it matured, learned to cooperate. Caleb Ross talked in warehouses and routes, in margins and load limits. He described a cold storage facility outside town leased through a cousin's LLC, guarded lightly because it pretended to be boring. They'll move tonight, he said, eyes darting to Ranger as if measuring loyalty by fur. They'll use snowmelt to mask tracks and schedule around shift changes. He wiped his palms on his jeans. They think you're hurt. He meant Luke. Luke met Emily's gaze. The look passed between them was not bravado, it was agreement. Then, let them, Luke said. His voice carried less force than it once had, but more certainty. He had learned that force invited attention. Certainty invited mistakes. They staged quietly. Emily secured warrants that did not advertise themselves. Mark set eyes along the access roads that locals ignored. Tessa Morales rerouted a maintenance crew with a signature that looked official because it was. Deputy Keller was kept busy elsewhere, which suited him. Not every lesson required a front-row seat. Luke stayed with Ranger until dusk, then stood when the dog insisted on standing too. Ranger held 10 seconds, then 20, breathing hard but proud. Luke counted without smiling. The cold storage facility sat like an apology at the edge of town, concrete walls sweating faintly as the thaw worked at their seams. Trucks arrived one by one, lights dimmed, engines purring. Men moved with practiced indifference, jackets zipped, high faces forgettable. Emily watched through glass that reflected her eyes back at her gray intent, unblinking. Mark's voice murmured positions. Tessa confirmed access points. Caleb Ross waited in a car he hated, rehearsing his cooperation like a prayer he didn't believe in. Ranger did not go to the facility. That decision was not symbolic, it was medical. His leg would not tolerate a sprint, and Luke would not trade the dog's future for a headline. Instead, Ranger stayed with Luke in the shadow of a service alley, nose working, cataloging the city's breath. When the first pallet shifted, Ranger stiffened. When a case slipped and cracked, the dog's ears snapped forward, a low sound vibrating in his chest. Luke felt it through the leash, a tuning fork of truth. Emily moved when the signal came not from Ranger, but from a clerk who made the mistake of checking a manifest twice. The lights came up. Doors sealed. The ordinary men learned what it meant to be counted. There was shouting, then brief and contained. No gunfire, no running worth the name. The kind of ending that disappointed those who wanted spectacle and satisfied those who wanted proof. By the time dawn touched the mountains, the facility had given up its language. Crates were photographed samples, sealed chains of custody laid out like careful bridges. Caleb Ross was escorted somewhere quiet to keep telling the truth until it ran out. Emily watched the sun hit the concrete and felt the city exhale. Not relief, recognition. Luke returned to Ranger with the light in his eyes that came after work done correctly. He knelt carefully and rested his forearms on his thighs. Ranger leaned into him, weight shared the injured leg, trembling but present. "You didn't miss it," Luke murmured. "You made it possible." Ranger's tail thumped once, controlled the way it always had. Later, back at the hospital, Maya adjusted the plan again, pleased despite herself. Dr. Hannah Brooks reviewed new scans and allowed a small smile to escape. Progress was still conditional, still earned. That was fine. Luke preferred earned things. Outside, Bozeman woke to headlines that avoided drama and leaned into facts. The city would argue later about blame and budgets and oversight. For now, it held its breath long enough to let the truth pass through. Luke watched snowmelt run along the curb and thought about mountains that tested men and dogs alike. He had not beaten the ground. He had listened until it told on itself. Spring announced itself without asking permission, arriving in Bozeman as a gradual loosening rather than a celebration. Snowmelt sang in gutters, the mountains shedding white, like an old story that had been told enough times. Luke Carter felt the change in his ribs first, less ache on inhalation, more confidence on exhalation, and then in Ranger, who greeted mornings with a seriousness that now included a ritual stretch. The German shepherd's hind leg still argued with gravity, but it argued standing. That mattered. The city, having exhaled once, learned to speak again. Court dates appeared like mile markers. Warehouses stayed sealed. The quiet kind of accountability began, the one that required chairs, files, and patience. Emily Parker moved between offices with a lean efficiency that came from winning without celebrating. She wore a charcoal blazer now instead of a field coat, auburn hair smoothed into a knot that meant meetings would be long. She did not soften facts. She let them sit. Luke's days split into two rhythms, recovery and testimony. He walked unassisted most mornings, cane relegated to the corner like a promise kept. His face had sharpened beard, trimmed back to a clean line that revealed the old scar at his nose, the one that caught light when he turned. He spoke plainly to attorneys who tried to turn courage into rhetoric. He refused medals he had not been offered. He accepted responsibility he had earned. Ranger's schedule grew public. Maya Chen added agility puzzles that felt like games, but were engineered like bridges. The dog hated the bright foam cones and tolerated them anyway, stepping through with deliberate care, ears flicking to Luke's breath. Dr. Hannah Brooks reviewed progress with a professional reserve that barely masked relief. The nerve had woken further, slowly, stubbornly, but enough to allow controlled climbs. "No miracles," she said. "Just work." Ranger accepted the verdict by licking her hand once, an endorsement measured and rare. The invitation arrived on a Tuesday, printed on thick paper that smelled faintly of toner and hope. Elaine Porter, the hospital's executive director, had insisted on a ceremony despite Luke's objections. Elaine was in her early 60s, tall and upright, with silver hair cut into a blunt bob that framed a face weathered by meetings rather than mountains. Her skin was pale eyes, blue and kind, but not sentimental. She believed institutions should remember people before they forgot them. "It won't be a parade," she told Luke over the phone, voice warm and unyielding. "It will be a thank you." Luke agreed on one condition: Ranger stood with him. Elaine agreed without negotiation. Preparation felt stranger than any operation Luke had planned. He wore a navy jacket that fit without announcing itself, jeans, clean boots, broken in. Ranger's harness was new, lightweight, supportive, a quiet declaration of faith. On the morning of the ceremony, Luke knelt to adjust it, and paused, forehead resting against Ranger's. The dog held steady weight, shared eyes bright. Humor flickered through Luke, then steadied into something like gratitude. The hospital atrium filled slowly. Nurses in scrubs, administrators in coats, city workers who had learned to trust drains and logs. Mark Ellison stood near the back, arms crossed, sandy beard, trimmed posture, relaxed in a way that meant alert. Tessa Morales arrived with a maintenance crew that clapped awkwardly and meant it. Noah Whitaker stayed near a column, glasses polished, hands folded, a man learning what it felt like to be useful without hiding. Emily Parker took a seat off to the side, unobtrusive, by design, gray eyes, tracking exits out of habit. Elaine Porter spoke first. She did not elevate voices. She named facts. She thanked responders, then narrowed the lens. "We honor persistence," she said, "the kind that doesn't ask for permission." She gestured, and Luke felt the room's attention settle without pressing. He walked forward with Ranger at his side. The dog's gait was not perfect, it was honest. Luke did not give a speech. He told a story. He spoke of snow that listened and ground that told on itself. He spoke of a dog who counted steps when he could not. He did not name enemies. He named work. When he finished, Ranger sat chest out, tail still. Applause arrived like weather unavoidable, then gone. Ranger surprised them all by standing again at the sound, holding long enough to make a point. The room laughed, the good kind, the one that releases tension without breaking respect. After children asked to pet Ranger, Maya supervised, smiling with one corner of her mouth. Dr. Brooks answered questions about nerve recovery with a surgeon's patience. Emily accepted thanks by redirecting it. Mark slipped out early. He preferred the edges. Tessa lingered to examine the atrium's floor drains and approved them with a nod. Outside, Luke and Ranger took a longer walk than usual. Spring light made the mountains look closer, as if they had leaned in to listen. Ranger paused at a curb, recalibrated, then stepped down without hesitation. Luke felt the leash relax. He realized then that healing had become a public sound, applause, footsteps, laughter, but its work remained private, counted in seconds held, and arguments won quietly against gravity. That night Luke wrote in his notebook again, the handwriting steadier than it had been weeks earlier. He did not write about ceremonies. He wrote about tomorrow's drills, and the way Ranger preferred the left turn first. He wrote about cities that learned to breathe and men who learned to wait. Ranger slept nearby, one ear cocked, scar hidden by new fur body arranged to rise without hurry. The case would continue. Appeals would arrive. Truth would need guarding long after cameras moved on. Luke knew this and felt no fatigue at the thought. He had learned something the mountain had tried to teach him: survival was not a finish line. It was a practice, and practice done right sounded like a city learning to say thank you without shouting. Summer reached Bozeman the way healing often does, without announcement, then all at once. The mornings warmed, the evenings lingered, and the mountains loosened their grip enough to let people believe in afternoons again. Luke Carter felt it in the steadiness of his stride and the absence of flinch when a door closed too hard. He had learned to move without measuring pain first. That alone felt like a small miracle. Ranger discovered summer through textures. Grass cooled his paws. Sun baked the concrete into a language that smelled like heat and patience. The German shepherd's gait still carried a memory, an almost imperceptible hitch when he turned too fast, but the brace was gone, replaced by muscle that had earned its confidence the slow way. His coat shone the scar, a pale seam hidden by new fur. He had grown broader through the chest, leaner through the waist, a working body that had learned how to forgive itself. The case did what cases eventually do when truth refuses to lie down. It concluded. Pleas were entered. Sentences took shape. The city learned to say names out loud and to read footnotes. Emily Parker sent a final email that was short and precise, thank yous buried among attachments, and then returned to work that would never make the paper. Luke read it twice and smiled once. Luke's life shifted not dramatically, but honestly. He taught part-time at a small training facility on the edge of town, working with handlers who needed someone to say less and demonstrate more. He spoke about patience as a tactic, about listening as an instrument. His beard was trimmed close now, jaw clean and sharp eyes softer at the corners. He slept through the night more often than not. When he woke, it was to Ranger's breath and the sound of wind learning the trees. A new chapter arrived in a way Luke didn't plan. Sarah Whitfield showed up on a Tuesday with a clipboard and a laugh that startled him into looking up. She was in her mid-30s, tall and lightly built, with sun-browned skin and sandy blonde hair pulled into a loose braid that refused strictness. Her eyes were green and direct, her smile practiced only at being honest. Sarah worked with a regional nonprofit that paired retired working dogs with community programs, therapy visits, search and rescue demonstrations, quiet afternoons with people who needed proof that bodies could keep promises. She had grown up on a ranch in Idaho, she said, where animals taught accountability better than lectures. A winter injury years earlier had ended her competitive riding career and left her with a gentler stubbornness. She recognized it immediately in Ranger. Ranger recognized her too. He sat without being asked, head tilted evaluating. Sarah knelt carefully, no sudden hands, and let him choose the distance. He closed it himself, nose brushing her sleeve. Luke watched the exchange with a neutrality that felt like relief. Trust, he knew, was a dialogue. They began small. One afternoon a week at a veterans clinic where conversations arrived tangled and left lighter. Ranger learned the rooms quickly, positioning himself with an intelligence that didn't need instruction. Luke stayed near, not hovering, letting the dog lead. Sarah observed, took notes, offered water. She didn't romanticize the work. She respected it. Joy announced itself in increments. Ranger's favorite became the left-hand path by the river where cottonwood fluff drifted like slow snow. Luke's favorite became the way Sarah listened without trying to solve him. They laughed about ordinary things, the indignity of squeaky toys, the drama of squirrels, the way Ranger pretended not to see treats until they moved closer. Humor returned like a neighbor who had been out of town and brought nothing but stories. The city hosted a small summer fair by the park, and the training facility set up a demonstration, not spectacle, just skill. Luke agreed to attend on one condition. Ranger decided when to stop. Sarah agreed. The crowd gathered in a loose semicircle. Children pointed, parents held phones at chest height and then put them away. Ranger moved through tasks with deliberate grace. Each success, a quiet nod to work done. When he paused, Luke knelt and ended the session without apology. Applause came anyway, brief and respectful. Afterward, Elaine Porter found them by the lemonade stand, silver hair bright in the sun. She did not speak of ceremonies. She spoke of funding for long-term canine rehabilitation and training scholarships for handlers who needed second chances. Mark Ellison stopped by, sandy beard gone gray in the heat, and offered a nod that meant everything. Tessa Morales approved the park's drainage with a grin. Noah Whitaker stood at a distance, hands folded, a man learning to occupy space without fear. That evening, Luke and Ranger walked the river path until the light thinned into gold. Sarah joined them, carrying a bag of apples that Ranger pretended not to notice. They sat on a flat stone where the water spoke to itself. Luke told her about the mountain, not the details, just the lesson. Sarah listened, braid slipping, loose eyes, kind and steady. Staying, she said, not as a question. Luke nodded. Staying had become a skill. Home felt different now. Luke's place held plants that survived because someone remembered them. Ranger slept stretched out, unguarded, one ear half raised out of habit. Luke wrote less in his notebook and lived more in the hours between meals. When he did write, it was to mark small things worth keeping: a good turn, a held stand, a shared laugh. The last warm night of summer arrived with crickets and a sky that refused darkness. Luke stood on the porch, Sarah beside him, Ranger between their feet like a promise with fur. He felt no need to name happiness. Naming could trap it. Instead, he breathed and let the quiet hold. If winter came again, and it would, Luke knew what he would bring to it: patience work and a dog who had learned to trust the ground. Hope, he had learned, did not need trumpets. It needed room. Sometimes the miracle is not the storm stopping, but the strength God places in a heart that refuses to quit. Sometimes it is not thunder or fire, but a quiet breath under snow, a loyal dog who keeps walking, a hand that reaches back when the world tries to bury the truth. This story reminds us that God's work often arrives disguised as patience, courage, and love that stays when leaving would be easier. In our daily lives, through illness, loneliness, loss, or exhaustion, miracles still happen when we choose compassion, when we protect what is right, and when we trust that no suffering is unseen by Him. If this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who needs hope today. Leave a comment telling us where you're watching from, and subscribe to the channel so we can continue sharing stories of faith, loyalty, and second chances. May God bless every viewer. Protect your loved ones, heal the weary, and place peace over your home tonight.